do a mic check first. Many of you may know the fictional story of the young girl in Kansas who was struck unconscious when a tornado ripped through her community. When she awakened, she found herself in a strange land, and all she knew was that she just wanted to get home. She meets people who tell her that there's a wizard who can actually grant that wish and help her get home. All she has to do is follow a path made of yellow bricks to get there. He lives in this beautiful place called Emerald City. Well, once she actually arrives there, she has to get past a gatekeeper. And she finds that not only does this wizard not reveal his actual identity, but he refuses to grant her wish. It wasn't until her dog accidentally pulled back a curtain that she realized it wasn't that he didn't want to grant her wish, he couldn't grant her wish. And Emerald City was nothing more than a facade, a cruel hoax to hide the fact that he was just a regular man with no special powers. Just as the wizard built Emerald City to serve as his facade, to cover the fact that he didn't have special powers, the same can happen in our businesses if we aren't careful. You see, we can spend so much time making our businesses look good on the outside that we fail to take a look at what's going on the inside. Marketing actually serves in a way as the facade of our businesses, but it's operations that actually takes a look at what's going on behind that proverbial curtain, the activities that actually take place behind the scenes in your business. If marketing is the promise that we make to our customers, then operations is how we actually deliver on that promise. Marketing is what we say, operations is what we actually do. If you go to many of these small business events and conferences and you look for this topic of operations or how to actually operate more efficiently, you'd be hard-pressed to find any conference that actually includes this type of information, with the exception of the Small Business Matters Conference. And if you do find that the topic is discussed, as small business owners, it's frustrating because it's usually reserved for manufacturing or large corporations. Whenever I approach the facilitators and organizers of these types of events and ask them why they exclude operations, they usually tell me the same thing. It's just not sexy. Operations just isn't sexy, which is infuriating to me personally. And I always usually respond by saying, well, neither is going out of business. You see, according to the United States Small Business Administration, close to 70% of small businesses will actually fail by their 10th year. Now, why is that? This is actually something I've spent the past 14 years really studying and analyzing. And yes, there are so many reasons why business fails. But I was really intrigued by those companies that failed not because they had insufficient cash flow. They also didn't fail because they didn't have a viable product or service. They failed because they had too much growth, too much business, and they didn't have the operational capacity to keep up with that growth. And as I started working with different small businesses over the years, I realized that there was a pattern. Their story was usually the same. And that story goes a little like this. They start off doing a great job marketing, branding, and promoting their businesses. And because they have such a great product or service, the business really takes off and just skyrockets. But because their demand is up here, and their ability to supply or have the operational capacity to meet that demand is much lower than the demand itself, their customers and their employees end up really, really angry. And if that imbalance goes on for too long, the business itself actually can implode. It's during these moments of fast, chaotic growth that operations really needs to be looked at more closely. It's at moments like this where Tim Fulton actually talks about it's a myth, this notion that the longer you're in business, the easier it will get. It's actually quite the opposite. The longer you're in business, the more complex it becomes. It's at that point where operations no longer becomes a nice to have, but a must have. Now, as I started working with all of these different small businesses over the past 14 years, I've done hundreds and hundreds of projects. I've also been very fortunate to work with very large corporations as well. So it's afforded me the opportunity to be able to compare and contrast things that go on in bigger companies in comparison to these smaller businesses. And I noticed with the smaller companies, a lot of times they had certain elements in place that were very similar to larger corporations, but there always seemed to be something missing. And what was missing was infrastructure. Now, when most people hear the word infrastructure, they think in terms of transportation. And transportation infrastructure simply links your different modes of transportation so that people and goods can flow as seamlessly and as efficiently as possible. But I'm not talking about transportation infrastructure. I'm talking about business infrastructure. And business infrastructure actually links your people, your processes, and your tools so that work and information flows as seamlessly and as efficiently as possible. Business infrastructure actually provides a foundation to reduce the chaos of fast growth. It also provides you with a foundation upon which you can scale your business in a profitable, sustainable, and repeatable way. Now, what I've learned over the years in implementing what I call business infrastructure in these fast-growing companies is that it actually answers 4 questions. What work needs to be done? How is that work organized? Who will actually do the work? And how is that work performed? Now, what's missing so often when we go to these types of small business events, even with a lot of the books that we read, they're very good at telling us the what, but not the how. And that's what we're going to focus on today, is how to actually implement business infrastructure. I've actually created a methodology to show how you can answer these 4 questions. And it all starts with going through a rigorous brainstorming exercise and literally documenting every single job, task, or activity that's performed in your company, whether it be on a daily, weekly, monthly, annual basis. I recommend using blank index cards, or you could even use Post-it notes, and just make sure you have a really large, flat surface. And as you start brainstorming these different activities, you also want to document things that you aren't currently doing in your business, but that you recognize you should be doing. Spread all of that across the table, and then the next thing you want to do is actually start to group like tasks or activities together into categories. Once you do that, give each category a name. That now becomes the name of your department. So in this example, we now have technically six departments for this particular organization. At this point, you've identified all your tasks, you've organized them into departments. Now you want to look at each department separately or individually and start assigning tasks to different roles or positions. Now, in keeping with the story about the wizard, we have the wizard and the gatekeeper. The wizard has 2 tasks that have been assigned to him, and the gatekeeper has 3 tasks. Once you identify the role, and you also want to identify these roles, even if those positions are unfilled in your business. You then want to identify whether or not that position is full-time, part-time. Is this something that you would outsource, maybe even offshore to someone? Is it a volunteer, an internship position? And also mark which positions are filled versus unfilled. Once you do all of that, the last piece here is to actually identify the chain of command or the reporting structure. And you'll see why this is important in a little bit. So at this point, again, you've identified all of your tasks, you've grouped them into categories or departments, you're actually assigning who will actually perform these tasks within each department. The next thing you want to do is It's probably the most tedious and the most detailed, but you actually want to start documenting your processes. So again, keeping with the operations department, let's say the wizard had a wish granting process, which we know doesn't work because he couldn't grant the wish, but let's just say, for sake of argument, that he did have a wish granting process. So you're going to take all of those tasks, you're going to start to put them in order and fill in where any information may be missing. And so here we've placed all the tasks in order. You already know at this point who's performing the task within this process. And then you also want to identify all of the tools that are needed to perform that process. And when I say tools, I mean things like templates, forms, checklists, software, apps, magic wands, whatever tools are needed to perform that actual process, you want to make sure you document that. The point is to have it documented so well that if somebody else were to pick up this process, they would be able to roughly produce the same result as if you had performed the process yourself. Lastly, you also want to make sure you identify metrics. Metrics actually let you know whether or not the process is being performed properly or not. The result of all of these exercises produces three main things. One, you now have job descriptions that are a lot more complete and a lot more descriptive because you've gone through such a rigorous exercise of brainstorming all of the different things that have to be done in your company. That alone can go a long way in reducing turnover because when someone, a prospective employee, reads that job description and they see all the things that he or she would have to be responsible for doing, that may let them know whether or not it's really a job that they would want to do. The other thing is you now have organizational charts that I like to say they're really like your company's vision board. A lot of times when we hear vision boards, they're more on a personal level. But your org chart is really like a vision board as well because think about it. At this point, you'll have an organizational chart that will show all of your departments, all of these positions, even if those positions aren't filled. But the point is you want to get it on paper and be able to share that to prospective investors as well as employees. This shows people where the growth opportunities may exist in your company. Lastly, your processes, which is really documenting how everything is done. And when you've done such a great job of getting all of those details onto paper, you can be assured that the way you deliver your product or service can remain roughly consistent regardless of who performs the process. And I like to say that your processes are really like your business recipes. You know, when you go to a restaurant and you have not just a restaurant, but if you have a recipe, whether I bake that cake or someone else bakes that cake, we should roughly produce the same results. So that's another way of thinking about the level of detail that's often required as you write your processes. Now, you may be looking at this and saying, there must be a catch. It can't be this easy. And it's not that easy. There actually is a catch. And this really works best when you have a culture of transparency and continuous improvement. And when you think about it, the wizard had people, he had processes, he had tools, but because he didn't have that transparency, no one really knew that he didn't have that ability to grant wishes. But the story of the wizard is really a rather benign story. The following story that I'm about to share with you is much more malignant, and it's a true story. Like the wizard, Elizabeth Holmes had an idea for a device. She started a company called Theranos, and her idea for this medical device was a piece of equipment that would literally be able to run up to 250 blood samples from a single prick of a person's finger. She quickly gained notoriety. As you can see here, she's on the cover of Fortune magazine. And her company soon grew to up to 700 people. She attracted investors like Rupert Murdoch, who alone invested $125 million in her company. She also secured a new headquarters space in the coveted Stanford Research Park in Silicon Valley. She also closed a major deal with Walgreens to distribute her blood testing machine in their pharmacies throughout the country. At one point, her company was actually worth $10 billion, and she was only in her 20s. This was her Emerald City. How could you not be impressed? Well, unfortunately for Elizabeth, there was an investigative journalist at the Wall Street Journal who literally pulled back the curtain on her company. And what he found was that her machine to run all these different blood tests, it actually did not work. And as a result, close to 1 million blood tests were deemed as false. Now, not only did her machine not work, but she had really brilliant people working for her. But because they worked in silos, there were veils of secrecy, NDAs that they were all forced to sign, and cross-communication was literally discouraged. And although she had processes can only work if you actually have an environment and a culture of continuous improvement. So when there were employees who kind of raised their hand and said, hey, something's wrong, this isn't working, they were ignored. And for those employees who persisted, they found that they were fired and threatened with lawsuits. Now, I can't help but wonder what could have happened had Elizabeth simply implemented a culture of transparency and continuous improvement. Now, as a result of all of this, thousands of people were misdiagnosed for very serious diseases like cancer. By its 14th year in business, her company was actually worth $0. Elizabeth will actually go on trial this summer. And if convicted, she faces up to 20 years in prison. Business infrastructure can fix a lot of things, but it's no cure for megalomania. Now, I didn't share that story with you to scare you. It's really just to share with you how serious this can be. I want you to think about your Emerald City. If someone were to pull the curtain on your company, would it be an illusion? Or would it be a true reflection of how your company actually operates? Always keep in mind these 4 questions and consider the people, the processes, and the tools that are needed to really scale your business in a profitable, sustainable, and repeatable way. This does take time to implement and put in place. It does require getting into the details, and if you're the type that doesn't like getting into the details, find someone who can be on your team who does like getting into the details. But I promise you it's worth it. Take the time to make sure that your business looks just as good on the inside as it does on the outside. Why? Because your small business matters. Thank you.